Well, thanks everybody for coming out and excited to talk with you guys about some of the research I've been conducting on mountain goats and avalanches. This is a kind of a culmination of a long-term project in many ways. I currently work for the University of Alaska Southeast, and I'm affiliated with also with the University of Victoria. And then previous to that, I worked with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and conducted long-term mountain goat studies in the southeastern Alaska region for 17 years. So what I'm going to be talking about today is one aspect of that research, and it relates to the relationships between mountain goats and avalanches. Let's see. Technical complications. Oh, there we go. There we go. So, so this is a really interesting project for me. I come from a wildlife ecologist background, and it's an integration of wildlife ecology and snow science. And so I've had the opportunity to collaborate with a number of different researchers, including snow scientists based here in Alaska, as well as in the lower 48 and even in Switzerland. And then also with some wildlife biologists colleagues, Tal Levy at Oregon State University, and my PhD advisor, Chris Darramont at the University of Victoria. I'd also like to acknowledge that the work that we've conducted takes place on the traditional territory of the Tlingit people, and I want to acknowledge that before I move on to the slide presentation. And so climate change is occurring rapidly in mountain ecosystems, much faster than in surrounding lowland areas, much like we hear about in the Arctic. And snow is an ubiquitous feature of mountain environments, blanketing the landscape for 9 months of the year.
Oh
And snow
my
can
god.
have is an important landscape altering force. And so what happens with snow in the mountains eventually travels downstream and has wide-reaching implications across a variety of different landscapes and landforms, including areas where humans live. And snow also can play an important role on the population dynamics of wildlife species that live in mountain environments. And this is a pretty remarkable photograph illustrating the kind of profound impacts that snow can have on mountain goats. This is a picture that was taken in December 2020 following an extreme atmospheric river event where there was 2.4 meters of snow that was deposited over 6 days. And this is a picture I took of free mountain goats when I was radio tracking them from the air. And you can see they've excavated these shelters in the snow to get down below the wind, but it gives you an appreciation for how deep the snow is and how challenging their lives can be in this kind of environment. And so climate and weather obviously are having an important impact on snow. And the way that we know that snow can have important effects on animal populations, and we often think of the indirect effects in ways in which snow influences summer conditions. So it influences the amount of water available for plants, it can influence plant nutritional characteristics. Snow patches can be thermal refugia for wildlife species that can help them cool during hot days or avoid harassing insects. In the wintertime, snow can impede locomotion, so increase their costs of movement, using up important energetic reserves that they have built up during the summer months that are critical for them to survive during the winter. Snow can also bury forage, so it can limit the amount of food that's available. And these factors can influence their nutritional condition, the reproduction and survival, and ultimately population growth and viability. But snow can also have direct effects on populations, and that's mediated through avalanche mortality, which can also impact survival, population growth, and viability. And so the focus of my talk today is on the avalanche side of the equation. And this is a dynamic that there's been very little study on not just for mountain goats, but for any species. And ultimately, what happens to mountain goats can have wide-reaching implications for the way the ecological communities function in mountain environments. So avalanches are a key disturbance mechanism in mountain environments, and they can provide benefits to mountain species. And so, for example, they can earlier spring green up may occur in avalanche terrain, places where snow has been slicked off the landscape, as illustrated in these two side-by-side panels. These are pictures that were taken in the Summit Creek watershed, which is a tributary of the Surcouf in the Upper Chilkat Valley. And you can see in April 20th, during the spring avalanche cycle, there's a lot of evidence of slides occurring in this part of the valley, and there's a little bit happening up here. And then going back, when I flew back and investigated that area on May 25th, you can see that those areas that slid have now greened up, and areas surrounding it that didn't slide still have snow. And so there's fresh, emergent, highly nutritious green vegetation that's available now in these areas that slid. And it coincides with the timing at which mountain goats are giving birth to their offspring, and they have high energetic demands associated with lactation. So it's occurring at a really critical period of time. And so by virtue of this, it's possible that avalanches are extending the growing season for mountain herbivores like mountain goats. Species like marmots also could benefit. Black and brown bears, of course, feed on vegetation in the spring. And so there may be important benefits of avalanches, but benefits do not only occur during the winter. And this is a really interesting observation that I had. This was a glide avalanche. So that's one that goes all the way down to the surface of the ground. And this occurred in mid-February, and the snow just slid all the way down the hillside and exposed green vegetation. And mountain goats moved into this area and were foraging in this area that's kind of highlighted in green. And you can see in this picture that there's a group of mountain goats here up above the crown line where there's sort of this fractured snow, and another group down here that's sort of zoomed in there. And that's the picture that was on the very first slide. But it gives you an appreciation for how avalanches could be beneficial to mountain goats, not just in the summer, but in the winter, but also the perilous relationship that they have with avalanches and the challenges associated with living in steep, rugged, mountainous terrain. So here's another picture, little bit different view of the same area. I've just sort of penciled in some of the trails that you can see if you really zoom in closely on the picture, about how they're just kind of moved in to this zone, and we're utilizing vegetation that was exposed and available that otherwise would have been buried under 6 to 8 feet of snow. But avalanches, of course, can also be costly, and animals can die in avalanches. This is an example. This was in Cahoon Creek, which is a tributary of the Porcupine Creek. And this is a mountain goat that was in this area that got taken out by an avalanche and deposited in this debris pile. And so up until the time that when we started doing studies, avalanches have been documented as a cause of mortality for mountain goats and even other species such as caribou, for example. But our knowledge about how avalanches might impact populations was largely anecdotal, designed to a few observations here and there. And so through the course of doing long-term studies, it provided us with an opportunity to sort of drill down deeper and to try and understand what some of the effects, how avalanches might affect populations. And so mountain goats are they're vulnerable to avalanches because they're using steep, rugged terrain, and they're well adapted. They're specialists for inhabiting steep, rugged terrain with their ability to climb in cliffs, their unique hoof morphology and body morphology. And it's considered to be thought adaptation to reduce the risk of predation by wolves. And so by reducing the risk of predation by wolves, they're putting them at exposure to the risk of avalanches. And so, for example, here's a figure that's based on some habitat modeling work that we did. And on the y-axis, we just have like predicting the probability of use of slope based on the steepness from 0 to 1. And so then we have here on the x-axis, or this is the relative probability of use, and then this is the slope steepness from 0 to 90. And you see that like mountain goats are optimally selecting for slopes that are about 40 degrees, which is pretty steep. And if you superimpose on that the slope steepness at which avalanches are most likely to occur, it almost perfectly coincides with the areas that avalanches are using. So again, bringing home this point that mountain goats are utilizing habitat that in areas of the landscape that are prone to avalanches. And so, as I touched on before, life in extreme environments is risky and involves a delicate balance. So these are animals that are living under extreme conditions, and as a result of that, they have low reproductive rates, low population growth, and thus they have fairly limited resilience to population impacts or perturbations. And so small impacts to the population can have long-standing impacts to the viability of those populations over time. And so it's important to understand each, factors such as avalanches and other important factors that influence mountain goat populations because of their vulnerability and their limited capacity to recover from changes. And mountain goats are also considered to be sentinels of change in mountain environments. And so we can learn about the state of mountain environments by understanding how mountain goat populations are functioning. And so with this, I'm going to move into the research objectives associated with our work. So specifically, we're interested in understanding how avalanches influence mountain goat population ecology. We're interested in the patterns over time and then across space. We're interested in understanding the mechanisms. So like, why are mountain goats dying in avalanches? We're interested in understanding then what are the resulting demographic implications, or how does that affect their population growth or trends? And then trying to also finally learn about what impacts that has for their conservation and biodiversity. And with this particular aspect of our study, we're focusing on how avalanches are influencing mountain goat mortality, population dynamics, as I mentioned. And so we're talking about the costs of living in this environment and the impacts that avalanches can have in a negative way. I touched on at the beginning of my presentation about how there can be benefits of avalanches. And so that's another dimension of our work that we're still working on. So tonight's kind of like the doom and gloom talk, but hopefully in the future, I'll have more information to share about what the benefits of avalanches can be. And so next I want to talk about just describe our study system. And so I studied mountain goats in 4 different areas in southeastern Alaska. In our Klukwan study area, which is sort of the region between Haines, Klukwan, and Skagway. On the eastern side of Lynn Canal, on Baranof Island, and then a small population on the Cleveland Peninsula. And as I mentioned before, these were field studies that I conducted while I was working for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And so I've been analyzing these data through a data sharing agreement with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. These areas are characterized by a temperate maritime and also transitional snow climates up in the northern part of the region, in this region. As we get further closer to the border, we have sort of a drier, colder, more interior type influence to the snowpack, whereas if you're on Baranof Island, it's very strongly influenced by maritime conditions. There's local variability in population trends, and mountain goats are both migratory and resident. And so what that means is that in the wintertime, in many parts of the region, mountain goats are making seasonal migrations from summer alpine habitat to low elevation, rugged, cliffy, often forested winter ranges. But in some parts of the range, particularly in this area, as you get closer to the transitional snow climate effects, mountain goats will winter at high elevation, and they don't migrate. They don't migrate between summer and winter ranges and spend their entire year in the alpine, or else they'll make migrations down to tree line. And so that I mention that because that can have implications on their exposure to avalanches. Most of the time, avalanches are occurring above the tree line, although that's not always the case. And then other species that occur in this area, as many of you know, include moose deer, brown bears, black bears, wolves, coyotes, and wolverines. But I have some asterisks next to brown bears and deer, because as many of you know, those are the only two species of this list that occur on Baranof Island. And so these are some photographs of these different study areas. This is the Lynn Canal study area on the eastern side of Lynn Canal, area that many of us look out at across frequently. And this is the Katsine River Delta looking down along the Kakwan Range. This is just one picture of what we call the Kakwan study area. This is actually a picture of Chilkoot Lake in the Chilkoot watershed. Sitka Sound and the Baranof Island study area, and then a picture of the Cleveland Peninsula study area. And all these pictures, you can see the steep, rugged terrain. You could see just by first glance that there's a lot of risk, a lot of avalanche habitat in these areas. And in fact, some of our work indicated that about 50 to 60% of these areas are composed of areas of terrain that is at risk of avalanches. And just looking at like this picture, for example, you can just sort of see lots of avalanche chutes coming down the ridge along Chilkoot Lake, or the same thing here along the Kakwan Range. So clearly avalanches are playing a major role in these mountain environments. And so to conduct these studies, studied mountain goats in these four areas over a 17-year period from 2005 until 2022. This involved capturing 421 animals and deploying them with GPS and VHF radio collars, which enabled us to document their movement patterns at a very high level of detail, as well as determine their survival rates. And if they died, we could then investigate those mortalities to understand how they died. And so over the course of the study, we documented 242 mountain goat mortalities, investigated those to determine how they died. I worked with my collaborators to develop avalanche terrain models for our study areas to be able to delineate where avalanche potential release areas are, and slide paths occur as a way of characterizing where avalanche terrain is across the study area. So one of the exciting things about this work was being able to integrate data from mountain goat GPS radio collars, which is shown here on this three-dimensional map. You can see the red dots are individual mountain goat locations that were taken over a 6 hour interval, and how they're moving across the landscape. And then these sort of blue polygons are showing where the avalanche hazard areas are. So you could sort of see how this is an area where there's avalanche hazard. This green triangle is a spot where the last known location of a mountain goat, and then this cross is where I recovered that mountain goat in avalanche debris. And so one of the things that just jumps out at you about this visual is how much time this mountain goat was spending in risky terrain that's designated as avalanche hazard. And so here's another result summarizing the proportion of mortalities that were caused by avalanches in the 4 different study areas here in the bottom, and then all of those areas combined. So overall, on average, we documented that 36% of all mortalities are caused by avalanches, but that varies spatially. For example, in the Lynn Canal area, we had 23% of animals dying from avalanches, and then as high as 65%, which is kind of covered here, but 65% of all mortalities were caused by avalanches on Baranof Island. So that's a very significant amount of mortality that's being caused by avalanches, clearly indicating that avalanches are an important cause of mortality. And so one of the further dimensions on this is trying to understand what part of the population is being killed by avalanches. And so what we find is that avalanches are removing animals from the population largely at random. And that's because we consider avalanches to be what we call occurring in what we call a wicked learning environment, or that's an environment where there's limited opportunity for trial and error learning. And so it's very difficult for animals to learn that they are at risk at avalanches and to change their behavior accordingly, because if each time they're exposed to an avalanche, they're likely going to die. And so that's one of the consequences of that, is that it's removing animals from the population at random. And so what that means is that a large fraction of the animals that are being killed are animals that are of prime age, that are particularly important for population growth, like prime-aged females. In contrast, if you consider malnutrition or predation, for example, those sources of mortality are typically taking the young animals and the old animals that are more vulnerable and that otherwise are not contributing that substantially to the population. And so as a result of that, avalanches may have a disproportionate impact on the population, given a same level of mortality as some of these other causes. So trying to understand the question of why do animals die in avalanches, we conducted an analysis where we looked at the proportion of time that animals spent in individual animals spent in avalanche terrain, and then determined whether or not those animals died or not. And so here on this y-axis, I have the use of avalanche terrain. So that's the amount of time an animal spent in avalanche terrain across the winter months. And so animals that are in red are ones that died in avalanches, and ones in blue are ones that did not die. And so we see that there's a seasonal pattern, and that they're spending more time on avalanche terrain earlier in winter and later in winter. But overall, there's a very clear difference between the amount of time that animals are spending in avalanche terrain and whether or not they died. So indeed, animals that are dying in avalanches are indeed living more dangerously. And so these bar graphs are illustrating the proportion of avalanche mortalities across the winter months. And so what we see here is that as you might expect, we see more avalanche mortality occurring in early winter, as well as the most occurring in late winter. So we sort of see these seasonal patterns that are occurring that coincide with our understanding about the stability of the snowpack, such that there's often instabilities in the snowpack early in the year, and then of course later in the spring when the snowpack is melting and there's a lot of spring avalanche activity. And so to kind of boil this down, we also estimated not just the proportion of mortalities that were caused by avalanches, but what fraction of the population is being removed by avalanches. And so this is summarized here with the 4 different study areas and the proportion of animals that are killed by avalanches each year. And on average, we see that about 7% of mountain goats are being killed by avalanches in a given year. And there's some variation depending upon the different study area. But the thing that's particularly notable is how much variation there is from year to year. And so these light dots are the estimates for a given year. And this big dot is the overall estimate for that area. So for Baranof Island, for example, there are some years where as much as 23% of the population died by avalanches. And for most of the populations, there were multiple years where at least 15% of the population were killed by avalanches. In some years we didn't document, we documented few, if any, avalanche mortalities. So there's a lot of variability, but some of these years when there's a lot of avalanche mortality occurring, it has the potential to be quite consequential for the mountain goat populations. And so in order to understand that, we developed a mountain goat population model. And I won't really like walk through all the details, but the idea was to be able to look at different scenarios. So to be able to understand if we had a mild year, an average year, or a severe year, not just how much is that influencing the survival of mountain goats, but how does that affect the mountain goat population growth rates. And so what we found is that in the worst case scenario, that if we had avalanches could result in a 15% cause the population to decline by 15%. On average years, populations would be increasing by about 1.5%. And then in the best case, if there's no avalanche mortality, a population might be increasing by 6.6%. And so one of the things that you see right off the bat is that a worst case scenario is quite a lot worse than a best case scenario is better. And so if a mountain goat population declines by 15%, and on an average year, it might only grow at 1.5%, it might take a long time for a population to bounce back from a bad avalanche year. And so that's the thing that we kind of have summarized here at the bottom, is that avalanches can elicit major population declines. And in that worst case scenario, it can take a mountain goat population 11 years to bounce back from a really bad avalanche year. 11 years coincides with the length of 1.5 mountain goat generations. So for the average animal, if it was born following a decline, the population might never recover back to where it was when it was born during its lifetime. And so to talk about the conservation implications, I wanted to touch on how avalanches might influence ecosystem services and biodiversity. And so one of the things that we investigated in the course of our work when we're looking at mortalities was the amount of evidence of scavengers that were utilizing mountain goat carcasses. And so that's sort of like broken down here in this pie chart. And we see that wolves, wolverines, black bears, brown bears, and a variety of other large and mesocarnivores are utilizing mountain goat carcasses when they die. In fact, all species of meso and large carnivores are utilizing mountain goats, using mountain goat carcasses to die. And then here are some pictures. Like this is a picture from a trail camera that I had on a mountain goat carcass with a coyote that was scavenging on it. It's sort of fighting with a bald eagle. There's a raven. The fact that animals are fighting over it and putting themselves at risk of each other just to be able to gain access to a mountain goat carcass suggests how important that might be to those species. There's a couple pictures of wolverines utilizing mountain goat carcass. This is an interesting one that was up beyond Porcupine, or beyond Mosquito Lake rather, avalanche chute that came down and killed a mountain goat. It was buried in this avalanche debris. And here's a picture of a brown bear. It's digging down in through the snowpack to access that mountain goat carcass. And there's a black bear there on the margin, sort of waiting its turn. And so these just anecdotes give you an appreciation for how important mountain goat carcasses might be for scavengers. And so to try and understand that, I compiled some information just to do some simple energetic modeling. It involved compiling information from the literature about the energetic requirements for wolverine, as specifically focusing on wolverines, gathering information about their energetic requirements, and then cross-referencing that with data that I'd collected about the average body mass of mountain goats, the average body fat, and then the amount of energy that a mountain goat carcass is contributing to the environment. And then I conducted some energetics modeling, which I'll spare you guys the details, but this is sort of like the take-home message right here. This is sort of showing the amount of wolverines that can be supported by the amount of mountain goat carrion in an area that's about 1,000 square kilometers. So that might be equivalent to roughly like the Chilkoot watershed. And we might expect there to be about, based on previous population estimates for wolverines, about like 9 to 10 wolverines in that size area. And so the mountain goat carrion in a mild winter that's contributed by avalanches, in a mild winter is obviously none, but on an average winter, it can be meeting about 60% of the needs of wolverines. And in a severe winter, it can be providing the needs for nearly 18 wolverines. And so it gives you an appreciation for how important mountain goat carcasses can be to a species like wolverines, and also the role that avalanches might play in influencing the availability of those nutritional resources for wolverines across the landscape. And so it kind of gives us this kind of deeper understanding of what the implications are of avalanches on mountain goats, but also species that depend on them as well. Yep.
Energy from one mountain goat carcass, that many wolverines, or from all the mountain goat carcasses in that area? I wasn't quite clear.
Yeah, so that was in that complicated modeling part that I skipped over. Yeah, so basically I, estimated the number of mountain goats that are in like in 1,000 square kilometer area based on, our estimates from doing aerial surveys. And then assuming that 23% of those animals might die during a bad winter, that would, generate like a certain amount of mountain goat carcasses across the landscape. Of those, like wolverines were documented to utilize about 20% of wolverine mountain goat carcasses that I examined. And then I can then estimate how much energy is being is comprised of all those mountain goats that could potentially be available and were being discovered by wolverines. So that's just kind of like a quick and dirty sketch of it, but and yeah, so it'd be like a combination of things. So typically, when we would investigate mortalities, we would be looking for evidence of different species that may have been scavenging on them, such as like tracks in the snow or scat, or like you mentioned, hair. Sometimes we had the opportunity to put up game cameras. So it'd be kind of a variety of different approaches that we would use to try and get information about scavenging behavior. And then I just got a couple more slides, and then we can get into some more questions. And so one of the things that's kind of germane to thinking about mountain goat management conservation relates to climate change. And previous work that we did focused on trying to understand how changes in summer temperature and winter snowfall through ecological pathways might influence mountain goat population dynamics, suggested that going into the future, increases in summer temperature would outweigh the effects of decreasing snowpack and would potentially lead to a negative prognosis for mountain goats going into the future. This doesn't explicitly incorporate the effects of avalanches. One specific mechanism for how summer temperature can influence mountain goat population ecology relates to how it may be shifting over time their summer range distribution. And so this is kind of some panels that we created that were projecting how mountain goat habitat, the distribution of mountain goat habitat might change going into the future. And so you see that like in the current conditions, it's a fairly large band, but then depending upon the scenario that you examine, the habitat is shifting up the mountainside. Of course, mountains are generally conically shaped, and so as you get higher up, there's less surface area, and so the amount of summer habitat that they'll have is expected to shrink. And so that's what this is illustrating. And so then the question becomes, how will, given what we know about how mountain goat populations might be affected based on ecological mechanisms, how might climate avalanche dynamics alter projected outcomes about how climate change might affect mountain goats? And so we don't have like a complete understanding of how climate change might affect avalanches in our area. We know that some of the key drivers of avalanches are structural weaknesses in the snowpack and high snowfall. And so avalanches can occur through multiple pathways. So you could have a lot of snow that then becomes unstable and slides, or you could have a weak crust layer, is illustrated here, where you might have a rain on snow event. So potentially even in a relatively mild winter, if you're having rain on the snowpack, creates a hard crust, then the snow that falls on that might be vulnerable to sliding. We know that in some work that's been done in southeastern Alaska is that we expect there to be less alpine snow, but we expect there to be more rain on snow events. Work that was done in western Montana suggested that we expect to see shifts from cold, dry to warm, wet avalanches. Warm, wet avalanches some work has shown that they're potentially more dangerous, resulting in more human mortalities due to entrainment in avalanches. And then some work has suggested that avalanches might be, or as snow is shifting higher up the hillside, that we might also expect avalanche hazard to likewise shift up the hillside, which could potentially be favorable for mountain goats. That is, unless they're also shifting their distribution up the hillside. So we have more to learn about how climate change and avalanches might influence the future of those relationships on mountain goats. So with that, I just want to finally acknowledge many different people that were involved in this study, including funders, field biologists who helped collect data, as well as pilots that also facilitated a lot of the field work. And with that, if there's any questions, we got some time. Go ahead.
My question's about risk assessment. I don't know if it's possible to answer that.
Is it Kevin something?
Yeah, boy.
There's a really steep slope and some of it.
He's been living this for decades.
Mm-hmm.
There. Do they even
17 years.
risk?
Mm-hmm.
They're going for that nutritional bonus. And at the same time,
That sounds like
Eric, do they consider that kind of risk if they're surprised by a predator or, a mountain goat hunter or somebody that looks like a mountain goat hunter or recreationist, something like that?
Yeah, those are really good questions, and something that we've thought and talked about quite a lot. They're questions that we don't really have like firm answers to at this point. I know. No, man, I'm working on that, but yeah, there's some researchers that, not necessarily there's a researcher who studied ibex in the Swiss Alps that kind of speculated that they had
I think we just lost Kevin. I think we lost everybody on Zoom. Some of the people had their cameras on. Everything's gone now. Oh, there's one person. Tim.
okay.
But
Yeah, anyways, your question was kind of multifaceted, but
yeah, but so if you've got a mountain goat on a cliff and some person comes by and surprises it, it has to decide, like sometimes they don't even indicate that there's any stress, but there probably is some kind of stress. But are they balancing the stress of this predator against having to run across an avalanche slope, get away from whatever's causing the stress?
Yeah, and so I mean, kind of like I touched on before, it's it's very clear we understand that mountain goats are using steep, rugged terrain to avoid the risk of predation. And so if they're disturbed by a predator or humans, you'll see them move to escape terrain, and that could potentially, if they aren't already in escape terrain, put them at greater exposure to avalanche risk. And so those are definitely things that maybe could could be important, but we don't have like clear understanding at this stage. Go ahead. Did you have a question back there?
I wonder how many people are at the presentation in the
Yeah.
library.
And one of the limitations, like in our work, is there hasn't been, we don't have access to good avalanche monitoring data sets, so that it's not like over that time that there's been avalanche activity in this area or other areas in the region. We've kind of investigated a little bit with like Eagle Crest ski area, might give you like kind of a regional metric of the amount of avalanche activity. But we just don't really have like a good handle on that. Unfortunately, it's something that we would like to try and better understand. With that said, I will mention that one of my collaborators, Eric Peich and Aaron Hood, they had a pretty interesting study. It was looking at a little bit different, way, but they would look at cross sections of trees, and they could determine if these trees that were in avalanche shoots were being impacted by avalanches, and then they could reconstruct over time when avalanches were occurring and build like ecology. That's kind of more of like a different time scale than kind of what's relevant. So that's kind of what I have for that topic.
So, what I'm kind of getting to is, if there, in your opinion, do you think that you're at more desk from avalanches, but in your 17 years that you've been researching? So that might indicate that we'll probably be more avalanches, maybe due to climate change, that's nobody likes to hear about.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, it's a good question. And so what we've sort of seen, I mean, even though like 17 years seems like a long time period, it's still kind of relatively short for kind of looking at these like longer term patterns. But what I can say is that like for some of the areas, like we've sort of, like particularly like in this area, there's connections to like kind of large scale weather patterns, like Pacific oscillation or like El Nino. And so we've had like, we'll have like some years where we'll have kind of a run of years where you've had pretty small amounts of avalanche mortality, and then we'll have some years that are kind of tracking the weather patterns that have been greater amounts of avalanche mortality. But I guess I don't really have like a direct answer to your question. Like we just see that there's quite a lot of variability from year to year, and it varies from place to place. So we know that some places have more avalanche mortality, like Baranof Island in here, whereas places like eastern side of Mindanao, less, that may be related to animals like spending more of their time wintering in low elevation forested habitats. So that's kind of like what we have to offer, I guess, about that.
I wish you mentioned about something about the wall, so when you have scavengers just waiting, like you saw a brown bear and the black bear, waiting for the brown bear to go to work. Obviously, him, watching him, obviously, or whatever. But what I'm saying is, well, I'm trying to blame it on climate change. So what I'm trying to say is, if we're having more goats die because of avalanches, it's changing the ecosystem because now our scavengers and eaters are now becoming predators. So that changes that whole cycle.
Right. Yeah, so
That's just my opinion, so.
no, and I think that's kind of like what I was sort of trying to illustrate. Like we don't have like all the pieces assembled yet, so we don't really know exactly how climate change is going to impact like mountain goats and the way that the ecological communities are operating. But we're so um, so hopefully it won't be too long before we have better knowledge about that and find the together kind of more completely. Yeah, so that's something that in the course of those studies, like on the east side of Lincoln now started in 2005, and then in the Paynes area started in 2010. Every year I would be flying aerial surveys and estimating population size of mountain goats on all these ranges. So we have good data for understanding the amount of mountain goats on each ridge system, as well as their change over time. And I think that from what I understand, since I have transitioned and began working with the university, I'm not sure if that work is sort of kept up, but I'm expecting that I'll be able to kind of continue that going into the future.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about how you avoided affecting your data because you're using a helicopter in order to gather the data? The distances that you found didn't appear that you disturbed what you flew over, and how far away did you need to land, practically speaking, to be able to go investigating targets?
Yeah, so usually what we would, there's a couple different ways that we would learn about animals dying. And so, animals that would have GPS radio collars, oftentimes I could download the data from a laptop computer, through like kind of a satellite link. But then also I could fly an aerial survey in a fixed wing aircraft, and we would circle above and download data. So then you could sort of map out where the animal is on the landscape, determine if they died and where that mortality took place. I would also monthly fly aerial surveys with a fixed wing aircraft and determine if animals were alive or dead. And if there was an animal that died, we would circle and investigate the site from the air to understand the best we can, how that animal died. And typically in the case of avalanches, it's pretty obvious, and so we were able to identify, that the animal died in an avalanche. Sometimes if an animal dies from predation versus malnutrition, you have to actually be kind of on the ground. And so then eventually we would fly in later with a helicopter. Sometimes if we could, we would use a boat or hike in and then investigate these sites. In many instances, these places are pretty remote and it would take, a significant amount of time to hike out there. And so a helicopter was only the only feasible way to really access those places.
And did you try to collar some every year to pick up additional data points?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So when animals would typically you'd have a certain number of animals that die every year, whether it's from avalanches or other causes. And then we would do capture work, routinely to, be able to build the sample size back up. So we had, statistically defensible sample sizes each year.
Did you collect age data and such when you did that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we would have information about a lot of information about the individual animals because it's very difficult and costly and to capture animals. And so we would get as much information as we could. So we would get information about sex and age and body condition. We'd get blood samples. We would send away for sent to a lab to do disease surveillance and look at, if they had trace mineral deficiencies and a wide variety of different topics. Yeah.
You had your your projection, your model based on like a bad year, an average year, and a good year.
Yep.
And it was like 15% and 1% and 6% or whatever, like negative 15. I think going forward with your work about like the clearing out the snow for like forage, do you have an idea about like what that will do to those numbers, or do you have a different model or something for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm just kind of focusing on the negative impacts, but there's the possibility that some of those negative impacts could be counterbalanced by some of the benefits in some circumstances. And so that's something that we're hoping to, kind of planning. I've done some work already, and we're hoping to kind of better understand, learn more about what the benefits are of avalanches in kind of the context that I described. So yeah, I'll have to kind of stay tuned for that, but that's something that we hope to kind of learn more about. And it's important, I think, to be able to provide a more balanced and complete picture about what the impacts of avalanches are. Yep.
So overall, are the mountain goat populations in each of those 4 areas stable, declining, increasing, and what other factors besides avalanches are impacting?
Yes, that's a good question. It's this area in particular, the Haines area is quite interesting because we have a lot of discrete ridge systems that are separated by valleys, and so mountain goats are very averse to moving outside of areas that have steep, rugged terrain. And so some genetics work that we've also done, and I've done in collaboration with researchers at Trent University in Ontario, has shown that there's very little movement between, like, say, Takshanook Ridge and Takin Ridge, or the Takincha Range, or Porcupine, Forewinds. And so there's little movement between these different populations. And so what happens in one population, like if there's an impact in one population, like say there's a big avalanche event, like it's not likely that there's going to be animals from another adjacent population kind of moving in and quote unquote rescuing that population. And so what we've seen, and we've seen that kind of play out in the aerial survey work and population estimation work I've done, and such that it seems like, there's often variability in the population trends in areas, and they aren't necessarily all like increasing or all decreasing. You'll see some that are stable, some that are more productive than others, and some that are decline, that have indicated declines, like the Takincha Range, for example, is one population that's historically has shown evidence of decline, whereas it seems like Takshanook Ridge has generally been relatively stable over time. Yeah.
Thank you. That's
Not
not an easy question, right? It's got a lot of complications.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Maybe you have this in the slide. What percentage of the animals that you're examining as carcasses were animals that were collared?
So they're all collared.
We're all.
So that's how I would know that there was an animal that died,
Okay, that's what
and that's how I would find it. And so actually, that kind of brings up a good point in that, um, you know, like when we're investigating animals that died from an avalanche, you know, we're generally just finding the animal that was collared. That's not to say that if it was like a nanny kid group, it could have been like, you know, 8 or 10 animals there, but we're only finding the one collared one. So we don't really have a good understanding about those dynamics, and that could be something that is important for mountain goats because they are social animals.
Right, well, I was just
Yeah.
wondering you know, if you're talking about how many animals are dying in avalanches, but you're only looking at the ones that were followed. You don't know what the rest of the population. What percentage of the, you have an idea of what percentage of the total population of the area?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so we generally like might have between like 5 and 10% of the population mark. So I think that like over time, we have a pretty good pulse on what's happening with the population. Just some of these like finer dynamics, like we're talking about, like you don't know if there's like the animal died in the avalanche, if it was solo, or if there was 5 animals with it. So from that standpoint, like our estimates of the amount of mortality might be conservative, but at the same time, like you are randomly sampling the population, and so you assume that you know over time that kind of balances itself out, and that you're getting an accurate estimate of what's happening with the overall population. But there's some levels of detail that we can't quite pin down. Is there a question back there? Oh, were you? Okay.
Maybe it's a little bit outside the box here, but what is the percentage of goats that indicated that the healthier segments of the population are the ones that are likely to die in an avalanche? You know, the mature adults and rather than the sick and the young and the old.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, it's more like
More random than that.
yeah, so it's more like avalanches are just taking like a random sample of the population.
Okay.
And because most of the animals in the population are these of the prime aged categories, though there's like most of the animals that are being killed are in that category.
So my question
Yeah.
is just for perspective, what percentage of the population is killed by hunters versus avalanches?
Yeah, so
Roughly.
yeah, right. That's a good question. So yeah, so generally speaking, like yeah. So generally speaking, like with human hunting, you know, and there's been a few different like kind of population modeling projects that have been done to sort of figure out what's like an appropriate sustainable amount of a population that can be harvested and allowing a population to maintain stability. And that generally, those papers are generally suggesting you can harvest between 1 and 4% of mountain goat population. And one of those analyses is one that we did, and it was suggesting, you know, around 2 or 3% of the population can be harvested. And so, if you cross-reference that with how Fish and Game are allocating mountain goats harvest opportunities and the quota that they're allowing, it sort of matches that pretty closely. And so generally, you know, it's like 1 to 4% of the population is being taken by hunters.
Yeah, and that's primarily farming.
Yeah, so about 75% of the harvest is males and about 25% is females, and that varies a little bit from place to place and year to year.
Much a smaller percent overall avalanche.
Yeah.
Because that's random, it covers all the ages and sizes and everything of goats.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because on average, we're documenting about 7% of the population is being killed by avalanches. So compare that to 2 to 4% that's being killed by hunters.
But also sometimes way more mortality from avalanches.
Yeah.
Whereas you never have more than 7%.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. And some as high as 23%. Yep. Yeah.
When you
Yeah.
figure in the females that are killed by hunters, and then you consider the fact that the nannies that have the kids, and usually they only have one, but occasionally they'll have two. What percentage does, how long, I figure that a goat lives around maybe 9 to 12, 13 years. And only, I think I read that female starts having young at about 4 or 5 years old.
Yeah, that's pretty.
So
Yeah.
we're looking at females 20-25%, but I would bet that the 75% of the males that are getting shot are shot by guides.
Are being shot by guides.
Well, guides that have hunters.
Yeah, yeah. That's correct. Yeah.
Having
Well, yeah.
I've seen there used to be 2,000 goats in Endicott. We're talking. I personally think the reason that the goat population is falling around here, all sitting in this room, it's called human race. I'm being serious.
Yeah.
I mean, logging roads, easy to get accessible.
Yeah.
Before we had to take airboats up there,
Mhm.
and I really personally think that if
That sounds
we're
like Craig
talking
Loomis.
about percentages of what we're going to save and what we're going to kill, from what it was back, and the disease, I'm pretty sure back in 1968, I think 69, they got a disease. They were so overpopulated that that disease stopped their reproduction. They couldn't eat. They got in their eyes, their ears. I've actually shot a couple of them. And so I'm thinking that my personal self is to get these goats to come back, we're just going to have to stop killing them. Period. There's nothing, what I've learned in hunting is avalanche is number one. Now, because of global warming, we got heat problem and lead poisoning. From hunters shooting too many
Mhm.
of young animals. Now, if you haven't been a big game guy, you shoot the mature bulls, and if you want, you can shoot a mature female brown bear because she's not going to reproduce any. But when you start shooting everything that's got little horns on it, big horns or whatever, I mean, we all eat. I used to eat goats. I don't have the desire to shoot goat anymore. First of all, I'm too old to get them. But
Yeah.
I'm just saying that I don't know. I've got a million questions going through my head after seeing thousands of goats.
Yeah, so it's an important point that, like hunting is of all these things that we're talking about, like hunting is one thing that we have control over,
Right.
And so one of the ways that you can kind of reduce the impact of that is by harvesting males. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. As you touched on, mountain goats have, they don't reproduce until they're 4 or 5 years old. They have, it's like they're reproductive.
Wow.
And so you get rid of one
It's
productive
right
female,
on.
that can have a pretty big impact.
10-year period, you're looking at.
Yeah. And so that's something that can really help. And there's been strides in trying to educate hunters. There's been some new regulations, from what I understand, about requiring animals to take the mountain goat identification quiz, for example. And so those things all help for sure. But I think that like one of the important points that I sort of try and make is that these they're animals that are living in an extreme environment, and in the best of times they have low reproductive rates, and so they're pretty sensitive to changes and small impacts, and so it's important, like when we think about like management conservation of the species, it's important to keep that in mind, and we're talking about harvest of like 1 to 4%, is pretty small compared if you're talking about like deer or moose or other big game species, throughout North America. Like we're taking like, that's a pretty small, it's a pretty small amount that we're very concerned with. And it's important to be concerned about that. and to think about all the different ways that we can kind of minimize the stress that these populations are experiencing.
But you being the biologist in this area, I mean, mind blowing how much it's changed around here with me. That the female species of any species, the number one thing that has to stay alive if you're going to reproduce that, right? And the more that you have of these, the more you're going to be able to rebuild this as quickly as you can. But because of climate change, the avalanches, when we were growing up around here, very seldom did we see any goats at all in avalanche kills because the snow is different. And now, just living where I live out here, just the temperatures change. There are just so many more avalanches that I'm looking at just over here. And if we're worried about those avalanches killing these animals, then it has to stop somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as you being a biologist, like seeing what in the past, I'm not going to mention any names or anything, who did what or whatever, but the moose population here was incredibly thick in the 60s. Okay, for 10 years they killed cows, calves, and bulls. Okay, we had to get it shut the whole thing down after that 10 years, but they came back because we quit killing the females. Now this is what I'm saying about the goat population. We want to get this back. We have to stop killing the females.
Mm-hmm.
Period. So I don't know how we're going to do that. You're the biologist. You figure it out.
Yeah, well, I'm not sort of involved with the management decisions
Well, you have
anymore, but yeah.
Some sort of an impact
Yeah.
study of what you're hearing
Yeah.
from us.
Right.
I don't
No.
But as being
Yeah.
a goat hunter, when I was
Yeah.
growing up around here, that's all we shot for females.
Yeah.
Because they tasted better. If you want to read a real good book about this area in the 60s and goat hunting, it's right here in this library. I just checked it out. It's called Hunt High by
Okay.
Duncan Gilchrist. And you should probably read it.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
About helicopters, about airplanes.
Yeah.
Back in them days, you
Uh-huh.
could fly and shoot same day. Endicott, okay?
Mhm.
Before they logged that, there was a ridge up there. He hiked.
Yeah. Lose him again?
Yeah.
Maybe he's done.
We'll see.
That factored into where, as a very more general, everything's great, but is the cost of the state population and it's the minor stable or exactly.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so generally speaking, that's the case. Like, so each of these sort of ridge systems has kind of it's designated a separate hunt area in which there'll be like a specific hunt quota. But it's not always the case everywhere. And in some cases, like those boundaries, like could use adjustment to kind of more closely match the biological population size. And, you know, there's different reasons why those changes haven't been made, you know, but that's kind of a question for like the local area wildlife management biologists to kind of to work on that. But that's been sort of, yeah, my understanding of how certain range, generally speaking, they're doing a pretty good job in this area of tracking.
When they're looking at those populations, they're looking at year to year, they're looking at like over a 5 years.
Yeah, so it kind of varies. Like, I mean, generally speaking, they want to go and have a population estimate every year. and then set quota for that year. But because there's such a vast area and it's difficult, expensive to do those surveys, it's not often possible for them to fly every area here. So they usually are like focusing on the kind of the highest priority, kind of prioritized areas based on the amount of traffic pressure. So some areas will be able to fly every year, some areas might be every 3 years or 5 years, and then they're kind of making those adjustments based on getting the best available information they have. So it's not a perfect system, but it's sort of one that's challenged by the practicalities of getting that data. First mount goats are a species that don't get the attention that other species get, so there's oftentimes traditionally been less funding available for monitoring management and safety or use or ground bears or something. Yeah.
I would get out what you're saying, but maybe what somebody trying to get to was because these valleys separate certain, goats, are we over one area? We finish that area.
Yeah, right.
That's what you're asking, but that's what it seems.
Yeah, that's been sort of a problem with mountain goat management in general, like historically, not just here, so to speak, but just kind of broadly, like throughout the range, is they're kind of being management that's occurring like not at the appropriate spatial scale. And so sometimes like there might be a large area where there's estimating the population size and determining the quota, but then all the harvest is taking place in one specific spot, so the piece goes from a localized area. So I think there's like, we've learned more about like the movement patterns of mountain goats, and there's been more opportunity to kind of make those adjustments so that management is occurring at the appropriate spatial scale that corresponds with the population, so you don't run the risk of having like localized depletion impacts. And I work with the Baranoff Island study was a good example of that, because over the course of that work, we did like kind of a major overhaul of how that area was managed and redefined and delineated, and it went from there being just one big hunt area with one quota for the whole island to having like 30 different hunt areas that were all like these discrete areas that were based on our field data, so that kind of helped them reduce like the chances of there being like overhang. So yeah, it's kind of an ongoing challenge for fishing games and kind of update sort of to that strategy. It's probably something that's really good to communicate with them about, to keep that like prioritized and on their radar. Yeah.
So the question that I wanted was, is it normal for all well, this is 0 mile right here. I live at 22. So when I'm driving up here, I see birds all over the ridge by the road. And even as the last summer and fall, we can see them on the trailer. Is this normal?
Yeah, so generally, there's some spots like about probably along the highway that goats come down in winter, which is cool, because you can sort of see them right from the road. And those are traditional wintering areas for goats in this area. And I think it's pretty typical to see them. And sometimes when we get big winters, they'll push them down further, and you might have higher opportunities to observe goats, and on mild winters they aren't they're sort of staying a little bit higher and aren't quite as visible. So it seems like it can vary depending upon the winter severity.
So what I would like to ask anyone here is, have you noticed a change of this goat behavior being on this side, this low, all year round on this section of the highway? Or has this just been happening? Are they coming this way because I remember going out here that there wasn't, you didn't really see goats like that.
I have seen, yeah, sometimes
So is
like,
it a normal thing, or is this just happened?
yeah, I think as far as since 2010, I've kind of noticed that pattern, but if if there's incidents of animals like being there year round, that would be something that I hadn't not that familiar with. I mean, I'm aware of like few instances of seeing animals kind of in what we think of as lower elevation habitats in summer, but it's not very common. But if you're sort of commonly seen on low elevations in those areas, that would be
All the way to the island?
yeah. During the summer. Oh, is that right? Yeah.
For me, it's a,
Yeah.
with this past winter, that was not, there was going on. They were high.
Yeah, so that's interesting to hear that. Yeah, that's interesting to try and learn more about what's going on there.
Thank you for this talk.
Yeah, thank you for your interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Like the work.